Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Welcome everyone to another week of Cash Plays. Tuesday, September 23rd, Limit Hold'em with Chris Death Donkey Vitch. I am, of course, Bart Hanson, joined by Death Donkey via Skype. How are you doing today, Chris?
Hey, Bart. I'm great. Thanks for having me on today.
Well, thanks for joining me. Before we hop into some detailed discussion of Limit Hold'em, some of you might be wondering why I'm not in England like I said I would be last week. Unfortunately for me, on Friday, I had a 6 p.m. flight leaving LAX, and I live in West Hollywood, so people are familiar with LA. Can sometimes be some traffic. Kind of got a late start. It was partly my fault, where I called the cab at 3 p.m., and normally the cab shows up in about 5 minutes. And, you know, the trip down to the airport can last anywhere from, 40 minutes to an hour. Unfortunately for me, the cab actually didn't show up at my place until an hour later. So it was around 4 p.m. when the cab showed up. So I was kind of frantic, hectic, little concerned that I might miss my flight, because you've got to be there, in advance for international flights. I had 3 bags with me that I had brought down onto the sidewalk, 2 bags of clothes and 1 bag that contained my laptop, passport, 3 iPods, and Bose noise-canceling headphones. And the cab finally got there. We got the bags in the cab and headed down to LAX. 50 minutes later, when we got out of LAX, I realized I had only have 2 bags with me, and my laptop bag was left out on the sidewalk. Called up somebody in the building, and of course it was gone. So I didn't have my passport. Thus, I'm still here in LA. I am, however, going on Wednesday night, and I will be there over the weekend for the main event of the WSOPE. Used a passport expediting service, so hopefully everything will turn out good. And again, that's that. Of course, you can email the show at cashplays@pokerroad.com. Send me a Skype at bart.hanson. And check out those Poker Road forums. Go to pokerroad.com, click on forums, and check out all the forums for Poker Road Radio, Big Poker Sundays, 2 Jacks, All Strategy, and all of that stuff. Chris, before we get into some deep strategy discussion about Limit Hold'em, I actually want to bring up a question that was raised on the forums. And this is just a general poker question about taking breaks. What is your feeling on taking breaks, when you should take breaks from the game, and basically how does taking a break help your overall game?
Okay, well, it's kind of funny for me because I play both online and live, and I have very different philosophies, I guess you could say, on taking breaks in those 2 situations. I think it's because I don't play live that frequently, so when I do, I get there and I just want to gamble my brains out for as long as I possibly can in a row. I take very few breaks when I'm playing live. I feel like it almost distracts me from keeping my strong just reads on the other players at the table, and just kind of being in the zone of enjoying playing live. I'll just sit in a chair, sit still for 8 hours and never even think about moving. But online, I think taking breaks is really important. I think people can get into situations where they're just, something goes bad and then something goes a little worse, and all of a sudden you're playing multiple tables online and you're on tilt, and the next hour's worth of play is all just going to be completely subpar. But because you're not willing to take a break, you just kind of keep trudging along hoping that it'll get better, and that's kind of one of the spots where you can play these epic long sessions, and in the middle you just see this nice I'm a limit player, so I think in big bets, you just see this nice 200 big bet downhill spiral into complete tilt mania come up. So I take lots of breaks when I play online. I also just can't seem to stare at the computer for more than an hour straight, and unless it's a very special situation, sometimes if you're in a heads-up match, obviously you don't really want to take a break. But overall, when I'm playing multiple tables or something like that, it's I'm burnt out after an hour. I need a 15 minutes away from my computer just to recharge my batteries.
I think that the guy actually who posted this question, and that's obviously a good answer in talking about taking breaks during a section. I think he's talking about taking prolonged breaks outside of sessions, like if you're running bad, taking a week off or something like that. Has that ever happened to you? And have you ever suggested that to someone, or how does that incorporate the game? Like, you've got a big downswing and maybe you want to work on your game away from the table, so you decide to take a few days off.
Yeah, and that's it's one of those things where, and I have had a number of students, in a situation like that, and it's easier for me to tell them to do it than it probably is to do it myself. But it's like when you're either a professional poker player or just a winning poker player that just is, used to playing a lot of hands or playing every day, you have it in your mind that the more hours you log, the more you're going to make your win rate or whatever it is, and you just feel like you're sitting there just making money, even when you're running kind of badly, as long as you don't run so badly that now you start to question everything. But when you do start to run badly, the first thing you think to yourself is, man, I just need to play even more hands, even more hours, and I'm just going to get through this like downswing, and everything's going to be fine because I'm a winning player, and that's what winning players do. And that's just the wrong attitude, because one, you're probably nowhere near playing as best as you can be, when you're feeling confident and happy and comfortable, and not kind of pressing yourself to get back whatever you just lost or anything like that. And then two is, if you play in a game with frequent opponents, your opponents are all kind of playing better against you because you're that guy who's running bad. They're subconsciously, feeling confident against you, and they're consciously winning more from you because of the fact that you've been losing. So they really probably will play better against you in that situation than any other time. So I think taking a break in a spot like that is absolutely the right thing to do. Taking a few days away from the games. Or one thing I like to do, because I do like to play almost every day, when I am in poker playing mode, is you just totally change games. Just do something different that will allow you to kind of hit the reset button on your whole approach towards the game. I love to go from playing 6 max limit hold'em to heads up to, say, I play deuce to 7 triple draw. Like just changing the game, and then or changing the limit to something that doesn't feel so significant to you is a way to just kind of forget about that mentality of getting back what you lost or getting out of like a bad run, and put you right back in the right frame of mind, I think.
So you definitely believe in I talked about this maybe a few episodes ago about, maybe putting in positive versus negative EV hours, that, if you're just, some people are like, well, I'm grinding, so the more hours I put in, the more that the overall expectation, the variance you reach what is the overall expectation. But sometimes they don't realize that negative EV hours, they might actually be, when they're putting in those hours, they actually might be at a negative rate for those hours, right?
Oh yeah, and not just that, but at least a diminished rate. And if you're playing at a diminished rate, what that's basically going to do is it's going to lead to huge fluctuation. And it's nice to say that you're just going to keep trudging along and logging those hours, but truth be told, I might not have the bankroll to get through all the hours of a very low win rate with the fluctuations that are going to come along with that it might take for me to get through it if I'm not careful. And if I just kind of continue trudging along, playing the highest limit that I might normally play, playing multiple tables, and just hoping that I kind of snap myself out of it.
And of course, in limit hold'em, the game that you specialize in, if your win rate is much lower, even if you are winning, but your win rate is much closer to zero, then of course your standard deviations and variance is that much more, right?
Oh yeah, and that's kind of the situation I'm thinking of when we're talking about this example, is just some of these higher stakes games, you're playing shorthanded, which is already kind of a high fluctuation environment, and now you're playing with a really low edge, and just be prepared for a roller coaster.
You talked about deuce to 7 triple draw. We're not really going to get into that here, but I want to point out to people, because I was checking out over, of course, on Deuces Crack, Chris's instructor over on deucescrack.com, that you guys look like you started, you've had 3 videos of Deuce, right? I don't remember the name of the series, but it's kind of the first time I've really seen some videos up there on a training site about deuce to 7.
Yeah, definitely. I'll take a bit of an aside to mention that. I'm currently doing that as my ongoing series on Deuces Cracked. The way we like to do things on Deuces Cracked is we have a season of episodes that kind of last for 8 weeks, and then each week I'll have my episode, and it'll have a specific sort of theme to it. So my season theme this season is deuce to seven triple draw, and in fact, it's a little more specific than that. I'm teaching one of our other main coaches, DJ Sensei, who's a good friend of mine, and is kind of a no-limit hold'em player, and I'm teaching him to play deuce to seven triple draw at various stakes on Poker Stars. In our series is called Triple the Gold, if you want to check that out. So it's a lot of fun for me because it is probably the game I play second most behind limit hold'em, and I've never really gotten a chance to talk triple draw strategy, on Deuces Crack before, and so it's a good opportunity to get people interested in kind of a really fun game that people don't know that much about, and definitely it's something that you can really get addicted to, I think.
Especially with that gamble mentality that some of those draw games have.
Yeah,
it's interesting that you said that you're. It's interesting you say you're working with DJ Sensei, a former No Limit player. What I'm going to basically be asking you about Limit Hold'em is a couple questions from your Min Bet Madness series, which you taught Foxwood's Fiend, who is a No Limit player, basically, how to work, how to become a winning player at the mid to high stakes limit level. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a couple videos from Relentless Assault, which was, I think, one of your newer series about Limit Hold'em. But mainly I want to focus on Min Bet Madness because it's the concept of bringing no limit hold'em players over to limit hold'em, whether it's back to limit hold'em because a lot of people started at limit hold'em, and just talking about some of the common leaks that you see with no limit hold'em players. And the very first thing that I want to start off with, Chris, is pretty elementary, but it seemed like it was very important, was just like pre-flop starting hand differences between the two games. Let's talk about like how high cards go up in value in limit hold'em, whereas mid-ish suited connectors and low pocket pairs go down, where it's pretty much the opposite, no limit hold'em, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you kind of definitely started the path towards what I would talk about here. Well, now, one thing I want to just mention is that I'm not a great no-limit player, and so I'm going to kind of maybe mention a couple no-limit concepts, and I hope that I don't get butchered for it. But basically, no-limit hold'em when it's played purely is much more of an implied odds game than limit hold'em because of the fact that you have deep stacks behind your preflop decisions. Whereas in limit hold'em, there's obviously going to be a finite limit on how many bets you can win after the flop. So exactly what you just said is true. The hands that have good implied odds that can win big pots don't get the opportunity to play big enough pots in limit hold'em to sometimes justify making poor preflop decisions. So something like a small pocket pair, where you're often going to have the right odds to call or raise preflop and no limit hold'em just to purely flop a set is not going to be true in limit hold'em because you're not going to be getting the right immediate price. And more so, you're not going to have the implied odds necessary to make up for the value you lose preflop after the flop, which is kind of what implied odds are all about. So when I do notice no limit players playing limit hold'em, usually they do overvalue some of those no limit hands. I'd like to call them like suited connectors and small pairs are the ones you really mentioned. Also ace X suited, where X is not very strong. People definitely like to get way too deep into hands with those, especially in like full ring games. I notice this when I play like live high stakes limit hold'em a good amount. If a no limit player's in the game, like under the gun raises, and now all of a sudden he's under the gun +1 with like ace-5 suited. I mean, that hand's just complete trash against an under the gun raiser's range. Like you're just so completely dominated that you just need to get out of the way. And yet, he's often going to find himself in there hoping to either just power his way through the hand by bluffing basically, or flopping some sort of flush draw and having it come home. So I think that's pretty much the gist of it there, would just be overvaluing the type of hands that are good implied odds hands, but not necessarily good limit hold'em hands, and then slightly undervaluing, big cards that sometimes no-limit players fear domination with, stuff like ace-jack offsuit or even king-queen offsuit. There's plenty of situations where they're great hands to play, and yet a no-limit player will be so concerned that his opponent is going to have him dominated that he won't play him in an obviously ideal situation.
And the thing about that, like especially when you do watch a lot of your videos, like with a hand like an ace jack, I think part of the reason why maybe a no limit player devalues that is because they're not really prepared to call bets on, say, the turn and on the river with ace high for showdown value, because you never really come into that situation,
That's
Chris,
true.
where you're basically calling a no limit with ace jack high, expecting that you're good.
Right, and if you ever do make a call in no limit with something like ace high, like it's just like an unbelievable hero call where everybody at the table just goes like, whoa, when it's good. But in limit hold'em, it's like extremely common. If you get dealt something like ace king and limit hold'em, you're going to be going to showdown a large percentage of the time, or you're just going to win the pot without going to showdown because you already have the best hand. So yeah, it's a different mentality, and it's just a different. It's something that, like you said, no limit players have an idea in their head. This is what this hand is worth, but they're also not ever in no limit. Rarely in situations where they're getting something like 10-1 pot odds on the river to make a call with ace high. I mean, when they get faced with a bet in no limit, they're getting faced with a large enough bet that the pot odds they're getting are 2-1, 3-1, maybe sometimes if they're lucky and their opponent makes a huge underbet 4-1. They don't know what it feels like to be getting 10-1, 15-1, 30-1 in a giant bloated pot where you have, second pair and it can't possibly be good unless the guy was just completely overplaying some huge draw. And yet in limit hold'em, those type of situations happen all the time.
One of the other things that you talked about that's a huge leak normally when a no-limit player starts playing limit hold'em for the first time is blind defense, specifically big blind defense. And Chris, I was actually a prop at the bike. That's kind of how I got my start, in poker when I was doing live at the bike, a 20-40 and 30-60 prop. Mm-hmm. And I was a pretty small winner in those games, like maybe half a big bet per hour. They weren't the greatest games, and as a prop, you usually weren't in the greatest games. But, I kind of learned how to play limit hold'em from Skalansky's book, Hold'em for Advanced Players. And I don't have that book in front of me, but I think part of the reason why my blind play was so bad was because I think in his book he said that in the big blind, you almost have to have as good a hand to call a raise as in any other position. So I would, routinely be folding, hands like, Jack 9 suited, Jack 10 offsuit, and not really paying attention to maybe like, 10-1 odds in multi-way pots, or even not realizing like even against a late position raiser, immediately getting, 3.5 to 1. Let's talk a little bit about big blind defense.
I think the most fair way to approach this topic is really just to give a brief history of like poker strategy, a very brief one, hopefully, because I've been around online poker for a few years now. Been a member of the 2+2 poker forums that where Skalansky and Malmuth that wrote a lot of the books that we take as kind of limit hold'em gospel were started. So at first the games were really good, and all the fish and all the bad players were too loose and too passive. And the correct advice to deal with that situation was that you needed to be tight and aggressive. Well, that was great right up until everybody figured that out and got too tight and too aggressive. And now the way to, some of the fish are actually playing too tight or too aggressive. And they're not huge fish when they're playing too tight and too aggressive. It's pretty hard to make huge mistakes by being a little too tight before the flop. But people are now just passing up opportunities for plus EV situations because of some advice that they heard about being tighter than, the bad players. Well, now with some of the new information that we have, just as far as long-term winners in some of the online games with millions of hands of data, and and maybe some of the other literature out there, we're learning that the best players, the ones that are winning the most in the games, are playing tighter than huge fish, but they're not passing up so many situations that they're not playing marginal hands when the pot odds justify it, or when the opportunity to play a pot with a bad player justifies it. And I think that kind of coined the term a lag tag. It's something I hear, and I say all the time actually, because people describe me as a lag tag, which basically just means someone who's tight and aggressive, but also a little bit on the loose and aggressive side, the lag part of that. And so anyway, that's the brief history of poker strategy that gets us back to blind defense, where the answer is, yeah, like you said, those books, those starting guides to playing described a situation where you wanted to play tighter and more aggressive than your fishy opponents. But now we understand more depth of the strategy to understand that the pot odds in situations like that can overcome your dominated hand And also, like you said, people are so much more aggressive these days that when somebody does raise in late position and you have that Jack 10 offsuit, you're just as likely to be dominating them as you are to have a dominated hand. So some of that advice really only applied when your opponents themselves were only raising with like 10 or 15% of their hands. Now they're attacking your big blind from the button with 40, 50, sometimes 60% of their hands. And a hand like Jack 10 just has so much immediate value against a range like that.
Absolutely. One of the leaks that you said about Foxwoods Fiend, and this was, in the first video, was that he was almost playing too loose aggressive. I think his stats were 39-29, 39 VPIP and 29% of of those hands were raised pre-flop. And he just got himself into situations, and I think sometimes this is probably common, especially if you've got like a loose aggressive style and no limit when you play a limit. Got himself into situations where he was, 3-betting with ace 10 offsuit, maybe in the small blind against maybe an under the gun +1 raiser, king queen offsuit, where maybe that play might not be too bad if you had position in the hand. But you really stress the importance of position. We talk about it in all forms of poker, but again, limit hold'em, very, very important, right?
Yes. It's very important in situations where both players have wide hand ranges, because then it adds an important variable or dimension to the hand. Like, when the button open raises and he's open raising with 50% of his hands and you're in the small blind, like, there's tons of hands that you could profitably play in that situation if you're just thinking of the immediate math of it. But the problem is you're just going to get outplayed after the flop. You're out of position and you're going to get outplayed. I don't necessarily agree with you that that's as important when you're dealing with, say, an under-the-gun raiser, because the tightness of his under-the-gun raising range is just so much more vastly relevant than the fact that he's going to be in position against you. Like, that's the thing that you more fear in that situation. It's not being out of position. It's playing a hands against the guy who just has a really tight and narrow range. And, and then, oh yeah, by the way, and you're out of position. So I agree with you that those hands would be better played on the button, but in both situations, you're really looking at playing a hand that's more likely dominated than not, and it's not a situation I'd be very happy about getting involved in. The other thing interesting about what you were saying about Foxwoods Fiend's mistakes there were just that he wasn't actually making the most common no-limit mistakes from my point of view. So he might not be the perfect candidate for a no-limit player transitioning to limit, because he had played some limit before, and he also just, figured out that when you're betting the minimum on each street, he was really encouraged by that to just want to get involved with all sorts of marginal hands. So he kind of made the adjustments on his own, and probably too much so, but it was still a good experience for us both, I think.
One of the other interesting things too that I noticed, and this is where I'm probably the most confused in limit hold'em, is we've talked a lot about board textures and no limit. If you raise it up with a hand like ace queen, ace jack, ace king, and the board comes out, 7-5-4 with 2 diamonds, a lot of times you're checking that hand back, even heads up, or in two, maybe in 3-way pot. It just seems to me that in limit hold'em, the flow of the game is that almost 100% of the time, the pre-flop raiser, whether he flops something or doesn't flop something, will bet the flop.
Sure.
So a guy has raised with ace jack against 1 or 2 opponents, and the board comes out 7-5-4. It seems like it's almost an auto bet. Is it an auto bet almost all the time? Are you ever not continuation betting a board? And let's say heads up or three-handed versus maybe if there's maybe more than 4 people in the pot.
Okay. I would say that. Let's take the easy example first. I usually believe that when you're in a 4-handed or more pot, basically 100% C betting just goes completely out the window, because at that point there's so many opponents with different hands in there that you're going to need. If you have something like you said, if you have ace high unimproved on a 7-5-4 with a flush draw flop, you're not going to win that hand unimproved. So now you have to decide whether there's just value in your bet, knowing that you're going to get called by somebody. I mean, and that's just an approximation of understanding how many people you're up against and the pot odds that they're going to be getting to continue. So in a situation like that, I totally agree that you should be basically just considering how your hand, hits the flop texture, and and if you should continue at all, and if so, how's the best way to go about that. But in three-way or heads-up pots, I do c-bet 100% of the time, and the basic reason for that is, especially if we break it down to a heads-up pot, is just that you often have the best hand if we're talking about a hand like ace high on that 7 high flop. I mean, there's no real reason to believe that your opponent has connected with that board, and the pot already has, at this point, at least 4 small bets in it. So just trying to protect the pot that's already out there is the immediate goal. And then the secondary and major reason that you would just c-bet that situation is because if you're playing against any sort of thinking opponent and you check behind on a flop like that, it's going to give him a ton of information about your hand range, and it's really going to make the hand easier for him to play, given that he's already out of position to you. He's now picked up a lot of information that's going to just make his play more correct for the remainder of the hand, especially as we're getting to the big bet streets, where it's more important to make good decisions. And so you could consider checking behind there on the flop with a bunch of different hands in your range, but it's just much more difficult to balance your play in that situation. And it's important to balance your play in a situation like that when you're playing against a thinking player, because, like you said, otherwise, he's just getting too much information that he can use against you in a valuable way. So maybe an alternative approach would be like checking behind that flop when you sometimes have that ace high, but then also sometimes checking behind when you flop like top pair, because then at least you keep a little deception in your range. It's just difficult to balance that. You wind up giving up EV because you're trying to figure out a way to balance, which now means you have to kind of slow play a pair. It really just leads to awkward and icky situations, and just betting to protect your hand, or just betting because you had the last aggression and your hand is more likely to have hit that flop than his, is pretty much the overall reason that you would just c-bet about 100% of the time there, I think.
Well, let's talk about theory then against opponents that basically in a heads up or maybe in a three-way pot c-bet 100% of the time. It seemed to me that if you're defending in a blind and you flop a hand like top pair or any hand that's worth betting, that it would almost always be correct then to check raise, because your opponent is always c-betting 100% of the time. Am I wrong there?
No, you're completely right, because it's like the hand hasn't even started yet until after his c-bet, right? If we know that he's c-betting 100% of the time, it's like you check to him and he bets, and now the flop action actually begins, because that was already predestined from preflop. So you really still have the first action. You just want to make sure that you get that extra small bet into the pot from his 100% c-bet. I mean, you would basically be just giving up the opportunity to get one more small bet in the pot when you know that you like your hand and you have a pair, by doing any other action there. So in a vacuum, that's definitely the ideal way to win the most from the hand. Now, there could be some other considerations where you would want to possibly like bluff by betting out there. We often call that play a donk bet for whatever reason. I think it coined because a lot of bad players used to make that play, and it's kind of a change-up play where somebody without the what you'd call quote unquote the momentum in the hand is the first aggressor on the flop. And and maybe you would want to bluff in a situation like that against a particular opponent, and so you need to kind of balance your play there by also donk betting out with something like top pair. But again, that's one of those things that's much more difficult to balance. And so, yeah, as you correctly pointed out, getting that guaranteed money in from the continuation bet, and then beginning to play your hand as the best hand by just basically check raising to protect it is usually going to be by far and away the most profitable strategy.
I want to get into an example here of a hand that Foxwood Fiend played, and I really learned a lot from this video, because I want to give you another alternative to the way that this hand played down. I think that Ariel opened with like ace-5 of diamonds on the cutoff, and the big blind called, and the board came out 8-9-4 with 2 hearts, 9 of hearts, 8 of hearts, 4 of spades, and of course, check, 100% continuation bet, check raise.
Right.
Now, this board seems to be draw heavy, and I think what you commented about is there's, a fair chance that a draw, is in your opponent's range here, a good amount of the time. So with ace-5 here, I mean, really the only way that you can, improve, obviously, is if you spike an ace, if you think that you're not good right now. But I want to give you 2 alternatives for the way that this hand goes down. Excuse me. If the turn comes out blank, like let's talk about 2 super safe turn and river cards. Like, let's say it comes off offsuit deuce, or maybe like high blank, like offsuit king, cards that really don't complete any type of draw whatsoever. Is that a spot where with ace high you might consider calling down just because of the nature of the flop?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I would consider that, like, and it's funny because, like, I understand, you're coming from a no-limit background for the most part, although you did say you played a decent amount of live limit hold'em. But for a lot of no-limit players out there, it might be surprising to hear this. But, I mean, I think any mid-stakes to high-stakes experienced limit hold'em player is going to say that's a very standard call-down situation. Like, no other play even really crosses my mind. I would not be even considering folding on those particular cards that you mentioned. It has to be a lot more murky of a turn and river card for me to consider folding on such a draw-heavy flop with ace high. And the reason is like what you said. I mean, it is just a very draw-friendly board where not only is there an obvious flush draw present, but there's just like hundreds of combinations of straight cards that your opponent would call with pre-flop that's now gonna definitely want to continue past this flop. And an important fact is that Foxwood's Fiend was playing these games that I believe this was either going to be at 1530 or 3060, which online are extremely aggressive games the way that they get played these days. So, we can take it as almost a guarantee that his opponent would be aggressive enough to play a draw that way on the flop, turn, and river.
And let me give you, a different example with the same holding. He raises it up with ace-5 of diamonds, big blind calls. Now the board comes out, queen-7 deuce rainbow. Mm-hmm. Check, bet, check, raise. Is this a spot where you actually would ever fold to a min bet check raise on the flop, or would you peel one and then fold maybe unimproved on the turn?
Well, I would peel there close to 100% of the time, but I would recommend that some of my students, for instance, might fold there. And the reason is, the question I ask myself in that situation is, well, what am I doing with other hands here that are better than ace high? If I have something like a pair of sevens here, or even something strong like a pair of queens, or a monster, obviously, now would I just 3-bet it right away on the flop, or would I just call the flop raise just like I am here with this ace high, and then with those type of strong hands planning to raise the turn for value? The more you err towards that, or opt towards that line, which would be delaying your next aggressive action until the turn, the more liberally you can call this flop check raise, because your opponent has to fear that he is going to get popped on the turn a good amount of the time. So he kind of then has to tailor his flop check raising range to not necessarily be so optimistic or bluffing you very often there, because he has to fear that he's going to get kind of taken to value town on the turn, for lack of a better way of saying it. But yeah, on a rainbow flop like that, there's definitely less hands that your opponent can represent that you can beat with your ace high. But then the next step along that line of thinking to keep in mind is that an aggressive opponent should also think about that, should also know that, and should then realize that he has more fold equity on a dry board like that because of the fact that his opponent has to say, well, he just has to have a pair here. So that's not at all a bad flop to check raise. We said queen 7 deuce rainbow, right?
Right.
That wouldn't at all be a bad flop to check raise as a bluff with something like 8-9, 8-10, 9-10. Basically cards that I feel, if you spike your pair on the turn, you're now going to be confidently being able to value bet. Those would be the type of hands that I would definitely want to continue with on a queen 7 deuce flop. And if you're going to continue on a flop like that with 10 high, much better to check raise, try to represent that you've connected with that dry board in some way. And like you said, have your opponent fold his ace or his king high or whatever.
Well, we're going to be right back with much more Limit Hold'em discussion with Chris Death Donkey right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays. Not listening to Huff and Stapes on Two Jacks in the Hole? Here's what you're missing.
That just seems like a whiny helicopter pilot to me. He blinded me. It's like when your parents would yell at you for turning on the dome light when you were a kid.
In the car.
Yeah,
right.
They'd be like, I can't see a goddamn thing. I know, I've been in the car many times when the dome light's been on, and I can see perfectly fine. I want to know what age it is that you can't drive with a dome light on anymore. Like at 40, all of a sudden the dome light comes on in the car, and you can't see anything. I'm sorry, Dad, I just wanted to read my Mad magazine.
Two Jacks in the Hole. Everything to do with laughs, nothing to do with poker. Only on PokerO.com. Cash Plays.
And we are back here on Cash Plays. Joining us, Death Donkey from Deuces Cracked. Of course, Chris, a lot of limit poker videos, limit hold'em. And we are specifically talking about limit hold'em in this week's episode. I want to bring up one of the other things that I drew from your video, Chris. And you talked a little bit about how you tend to play a little more passively on paired boards because there tends to be far less fold equity against ace highs. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I think that kind of also comes from a lot of my heads-up limit hold'em experience, where you really get into the mentality of the average opponent that you get up against, who may not necessarily have studied poker in any sort of formal way, but he just plays a decent amount of it. He's kind of a self-taught, thinking, but maybe break even to slightly winning player. And and everybody recognizes immediately that when the board is paired, there's just less combinations of cards that can have connected with that board. So what usually ends up happening is that it becomes a board where unsophisticated opponents will be more likely to bluff you because that's the extent of their thinking. They go, well, my opponent has a hard time hitting this flop. The flop came queen, queen, deuce. It just doesn't make that much sense that he's hit this board, so I'm going to try to win this pot. Or if your opponent is more sophisticated, he's going to think to himself, taking it to the next level, well, neither of us are likely to have hit this board, so if I have ace high, I'm going to play it pretty confidently here. It's going to be either the best hand and I'm going to value bet it, or if my opponent makes some sort of aggressive action, I'm going to be pretty happy to calm down because he's just going to have a monster here to beat me, and it's going to be a pretty easy call down for me on this paired board.
One of the other things that you talked about too, and maybe people don't realize, is how you say that seat position can really make a huge difference in a particular game. And a lot of this stuff was actually it's not really foreign to no limit players. Some of the same things apply. But what are you looking for in a seat position in a particular game in limit hold'em? Ideal seat position.
Sure, good question. Ideal seat position would be the worst player in the game on my right and a tight or uncreative player on my left. That really puts me in an ideal position to play a lot of marginal hands against the bad player, and at the same time not have to worry that the guy on my left is going to frequently put me into difficult positions by either re-raising me pre-flop or even just cold calling pre-flop and then playing kind of aggressively or trickily after the flop. Him having the superior position there is going to make a lot of my marginal hands really difficult to play. Obviously, it's not a problem when I have something like ace-king or a big pocket pair. I'm going to be thrilled, to have anybody anywhere at the table when I have a hand as good as that. But, to really maximize your win rate in a game, being able to profitably play tons of marginal hands that are only profitable under ideal conditions, is really what you're hoping to accomplish. So, basically looking for the most loose and bad players to be to my right, and the more tight or passive and uncreative players to my left that are going to not give me a lot of trouble. And basically I'm going to be able to respect whatever actions they take in the hand. So I can trust that when they raise me that they have the hand that they're representing, and I can have an easy fold, stuff like that.
And I'm assuming that a bad table position would maybe have a good laggy player who understands your opening range to your left, maybe something like that.
Yes, absolutely. I mean that can create the most difficult situations that you'll face in limit hold'em, because when you're in a tougher game where there's not a lot of like loose players that are constantly limping into the pot and bloating the pots pre-flop, what it often comes down to is a marginal situation where either you're attacking the blinds from late position, from the cutoff or the button, and the blinds are defending aggressively by either 3-betting or calling, or you're in an actual blind battle from the small blind against the big blind after everybody else is folded. In shorthand games or in tough high-stakes games, these situations are the ones that are the most frequent. So, the more tricky, tough, and aggressive the opponent to your left is, the more you're going to be handcuffed in those marginal spots, because as I was saying, you only have marginal hands in situations like that. I mean, you're going to want to be attacking his blind with 40, 50% of your hands, but if he's playing that tough and he's going to be in position against you, it's going to create a situation where you really have to give a lot more respect to his position and possibly fold a lot of hands that might be profitable against other opponent types.
And we're kind of jumping all over the place here, but one thing that I didn't ask you before the commercial that I wanted to get to, but I don't want to leave alone, is small blind half bet completion. And, there are a couple of hands where, and again, situations maybe where no-limit players don't understand, where I saw some of the students that you were teaching maybe complete with like a king-deuce offsuit in the small blind, but fold a hand like 10-6 or 10-7. And you said that you would much prefer, the 10-6 than maybe to the king deuce. Does that have to do with domination and flopping top pair and being able to?
The immediate way of thinking about a hand like king deuce, like some people would go, well, at least then I have king high. But the thing is, when you have king high and it's the best hand, it's rare that you go to showdown. You often just continuation bet the flop and you win the hand right there. Your king high was the best hand and you won the pot. Your opponent didn't flop anything. That's pretty easy. But people like to think like, well, okay, so I had king high, so it gave me more showdown value than something like 10 high. But how often is it that you're really getting to showdown with king deuce offsuit and having it be the best hand? I mean, it's like, yes, it has more showdown value in theory, but in practice, it's not a hand that you're taking to showdown very often. I don't want to say never because I've definitely called down with worse than king high, but you're not going to realize the value that king high has compared to 10 high in a situation like that. So you may as well have a hand that has just more ways to improve than a hand like king deuce. I mean, a hand like 10-7 at least has straight potential. It still has a decent amount of high card strength, and also at the same time, if you play it as aggressively as you might play that king high, you're going to win all those same flops where neither you nor your opponent really has anything. So just the fact that you actually have 10 high instead of king high doesn't really change that situation all that much. But think about what you're gaining, which is the rare times that your king deuce is completely dominated and you flop top pair and get crushed by king queen or king jack. That's less likely to happen with a hand like 10-7. It's just less likely to be dominated by hands that your typical opponent is frequently playing pre-flop. So it avoids some of the reverse implied odds from a situation like that, and at the same time, you still win all those hands where neither you nor your opponent have anything, I guess would be my way of summarizing it.
One of the interesting things that I saw in your Relentless Assault series, you're talking about how you kind of merge your play in shorthanded pots when you flop top pair, usually in position, and you get check raised. And I'm just going to throw you an example off the top of my head. Actually, I think that there was one specific hand where you had raised it up with Jack 9, and I think the guy had called, and the board came out Jack high. I think it was like something like Jack 4-5. And he checked you, you bet, and he check raised you. And you said that you think that you're good here most of the time, but to kind of balance your range where you might be peeling extremely lightly, like with gut shots, in other situations, here you're just going to call and maybe go for a big bet on the turn, because a lot of the time, you might be peeling there with a hand like, 8, let's see, if it was Jack, say the board was like Jack 5-6 and you had like a hand like 8-9. Well, of course you're going to peel for a bet. So you're balancing that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and actually that kind of takes us back a little bit to that hand that we were talking about that Foxwoods Fiend played in the other series, where he had that ace-5, and we were saying, well, what do you like to do on that queen-7 deuce rainbow board? Well, you'd like to be able to profitably peel there, but in order to be able to profitably peel there, your whole hand range has to have a synchronicity to it that makes sense. You have to be able to protect the times that you call that flop check raise really lightly by calling that flop check raise with hands that have a lot more value. So like on that jack high board that we're talking about here, I'm very confident that my hand is the best hand, but there may be both more immediate value in waiting till the turn to possibly get my opponent to put in multiple bets on the turn and then still call me down with the worst hand. Plus, there's also the kind of the metagame value or the range balancing value of waiting until the turn with such a strong hand like that, so that my opponent can't feel that when I just call his flop check raise that I only have those weak peeling hands. it really forces him into a situation where he can't check raise, semi-bluff me, or bluff me quite as often, because he is going to get punished on the turn with raises when I do have good hands, and at the same time he knows that he's never going to be able to just take down the pot immediately because I'm going to be peeling with a wide range. So it basically just makes me more stubborn and difficult to play against. Keep in mind, in about all these, in this situation we're describing, I'm always in position. So, imagine for a second that we're the out-of-position guy who check raises the flop. If we know for a fact that our opponent is never folding on the flop and frequently raising us on the turn, we're definitely going to be a little bit more timid about the hands that we choose to check raise on the flop and bet on the turn. And that's kind of good to encourage that attitude in your opponents, because you do want to play so many marginal hands that aren't going to be very happy to get check raised on the flop. So encouraging your opponent to play more timidly against us is definitely a good thing when we have all those marginal hands.
Another, fairly advanced concept that you talked about in detail in your videos, but I want to get into it here for people that haven't seen your videos, was the fact that you basically cold call your entire range out of position to a 3-bet. And what I mean by that is you open for a raise and a guy 3-bets you, it gets back to you heads up, and you're cold calling there with your entire range as opposed to 4-betting.
Yeah,
let's talk a little bit about that.
It was a really eye-opening / interesting concept that I think for a lot of our members when they saw me present this concept in a video. And I really can't take credit for creating this idea. I definitely did not. I mean, I believe I got it from a friend of mine who's a very successful high-stakes online player these days, KPR16, plays on multiple sites under that name, who talks a lot about balancing your play, and I am all about playing in a balanced way, because when you are up against tough-thinking opponents, you're less going to be able to find easy ways to exploit their mistakes. So it's better to just try to minimize the ways that they can exploit your mistakes. And by being a balanced player, that allows you, to avoid being exploited. So the concept is this: it's that first of all, it only applies to heads-up pots, because in a multi-way pot, there's just so much immediate value in getting two opponents to put in another small bet pre-flop when you have a dominating, crushing hand at the top part of your range. So in a heads-up pot, out of position, that's another key factor here, is that we're out of position. When we just call a 3-bet pre-flop and we check to our opponent on the flop, we pretty much already said, earlier on talking today, that they're going to c-bet 100% of the time. So they've effectively put in 4 small bets, and absolutely nothing has changed about the quality of their hand range or the quality of your hand range. They don't know any more information about your hand than they did pre-flop. So they've put in 4 small bets, and now let's say we just check raise the flop 100% of the time after just calling. We're talking about calling pre-flop with good hands. So let's say we have pocket aces, and we just called pre-flop their 3-bet. Now we check raise the flop. Okay, so they've put in 4 small bets, and now we've finally given them some more information that they can use, which is that we've decided to check raise this flop. Now contrast that with if we just capped our hand pre-flop or value. Almost all these online sites have a 4-bet cap, and that's kind of where this idea definitely stems from. If you're in a live game with no cap heads up, there may be more value in trying to get in 6, 7, 8 bets against a maniacal opponent pre-flop. But online with a 4-bet cap, this isn't necessarily true. So if we cap it pre-flop, they put in those same 4 small bets, and now we're the ones who are going to c-bet the flop 100% of the time, and we're out of position. At that point, if they respect our cap, they're going to fold a lot of the weakest hands in their range, and we're not going to make any more money. So we've made only 4 small bets, and at the same time, we've given our opponent a lot more information about our hand range, because we're only capping with a pretty narrow range there. So basically, the idea is that when you're out of position, if you just call the 3-bet and check to them on the flop, they've still put in those same 4 small bets. You have the same information about their hand range, but they have way less information about your hand range, because you haven't taken that one extra action that would really narrowly define your range. And at the same time, they've still put in the same amount of bets, so I don't really see it as much of a negative at all.
And of course, so because you have not capped it pre-flop, when the guy auto bets, when he continuation bets 100% of the time, you're saying that and you make the check raise, they're peeling way, way lighter than that's if true. You were to 4-bet and then just bet the flop, they might fold because your range is so polarized, right? right, when you format.
Yeah, well, and I
pre-flop.
wouldn't even say polarized, because polarized implies that has both strong qualities and really weak qualities. I mean, when you're capping pre-flop in a situation like that, you really have just almost always the top part of your range. And some really loose aggressive players will sometimes cap with the middle part of the range, which would be like good hands that they open raised with, but generally people would say that hand's not worth a cap. So a hand like Jack 10 suited. But really, there's no really weak hands in your range because you already chose to open raise. It's not like you open raised with 2-6 off suit and now you're going to cap it for deception. That's just not a part of your range. So yeah, so what you said is true. I mean, in a way, it's actually better because now you're encouraging them to peel the flop more likely when they don't realize that your range is actually as strong as it is. Because they didn't get that one piece of information that would really make a big difference in their ability to play correctly against your range here.
Now, let me ask you: do you make an exception for this rule, though? However, when it's a blind versus blind battle, and what I mean by that is, if you're open raising in the small blind and you have an extremely premium hand, I would expect that sometimes you might cap there out of position for value because your opponent still probably wouldn't put you on as good of a hand if it was, if the play was going on out in the field.
Yeah, and I know what you're saying, and you make a good point. But my counterpoint would be that in the small blind, you also want to play a lot more hands than you might say when you open raise from middle position. So now I have more weak hands in my range that need that protection of me having the potential to have pocket aces. So if I'm in middle position and I'm going to open raise with, say, 25% of my hand range, which is still pretty loose for middle position. I'm like I said, I'm not going to cap if I get 3-bet. So I'm protecting that 25% range by not capping with my premium hands. But now I'm in the small blind and I want to open raise like 50%, maybe 60% of my hand range against certain opponents because I already have a small bet in the pot. I'm getting a good price to try to steal his big blind or just continue with the hand. And, it would be pretty weak tight of me to just be folding all but the top 25% of my hand range when it's folded to me in the small blind. So now I have so many more marginal hands between that 25 percentile and that, say, 50 percentile or 60 percentile that need the protection of me having the potential to have strong hands, that I think that you're still giving up too much information when you do cap there. Because, like you said, there's more immediate value in them not thinking that you have a totally premium hand, but all the other factors are still true. They're still going to c-bet the flop 100% of the time, and if you check raise that flop, they're still going to have to now react to that new information and decide how that affects your hand range. And if you do have such a wide range, it's even more valuable to every now and then be able to protect that range by having a strong hand that they might not expect you to have.
And we, of course, are talking specifically about out of position because it looked to me like you tend to cap for value in position. Yes. And kind of take the opposite approach.
Exactly.
Right?
And if you think about it from just a really macroeconomic point of view, it makes sense, right? Because let's just say, okay, Bart, we're going to play poker for the next year. We're going to play limit hold'em, and every time you're in position, the pot is going to be an extra big bet bigger, 2 small bets bigger, and every time you're out of position, the pot is 2 small bets smaller. That would be a pretty good deal for you. You would want that to be the case, compared to the compared to the alternative. So that's kind of what we're trying to force to happen by playing this way pre-flop in heads-up pots. Basically, we end up in situations where we still have a fairly wide range, our opponent has a fairly wide range, and yet when we're in position, the pots, curiously, are always a little bit bigger. That's like a subtle way to increase your profitability in a game and at the same time not really open yourself up to exploitation because your opponent has a really hard time dealing with the fact that you're either in position capping with a slightly wide range that's kind of well balanced, or out of position never capping at all and keeping your range incredibly balanced. Now you're also tailoring the size of the pot to meet the position that you're in. It really is valuable, and it's something that people kind of underestimate, I think.
One of the things that, another concept that you mentioned, but kind of didn't really go into detail, but I want to hit on a little bit about, it was about how in small pots, you think that a strong part of your game is checking to induce bluffs. Mm-hmm. And that's where you pick up a lot of money. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a huge concept that is true when you're playing in tough games or in shorthanded games because, like you said, the conventional wisdom of learning how to play poker, and especially limit hold'em, was you play tight and then you play aggressive. When you have a good hand, you play it very aggressively. You protect your hand from those fish. But that game was predicated on the idea that your opponents are loose and passive and frequently calling you down. Now, the way the games are, especially online mid-stakes or live high-stakes games, your opponents aren't loose and passive. They're tough and aggressive, and sometimes not that tough, but still loose and fairly aggressive. It's rare you find a truly loose and passive player at the stakes we're talking about. So you don't necessarily give up the opportunity to get value from them just because you checked. I mean, how many times do you check a weak hand? Like, let's say you raise preflop with Jack 10 suited and completely whiff, and you just check the turn. Your opponent bets there like 99% of the time, and you think to yourself like, oh man, like, I just have to fold now. I have no way to win this hand. I mean, if that's true, all the other times that you have a stronger hand and you choose not to check and let him bet in that situation, you're giving up an opportunity cost of potentially having your opponent put in more money when he might not had you bet yourself. So in a small pot, it's kind of like you're on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is protection, and on the other end of the spectrum is value. Well, the larger the pot, the more you're concerned about protection. The smaller the pot, the more you're concerned about value. So sometimes the only way to get value from an opponent who doesn't have much of a hand is to throw him a little bit of rope, or to even let him have a free card. As much of an amazing idea as that might sound to people, like, oh my gosh, I could never give a free card. The pot has like one bet in it. Like, how bad could it really be to give your opponent a free card, especially if you often have him drawing to like 3 outs? I mean, it's just not that big of an error. And at the same time, you might be able to eke out a whole big bet in profit on a later street if he winds up making something that's worse than your hand, or winds up bluffing. So, the smaller the pot, the much more concerned I am going to be about finding ways to extract value that might not be the most obvious ways. And then there's no real clear. I can't give you an answer as far as what pot size would my thinking completely change. But it's just kind of a spectrum. It's like, in a close situation, I'm going to opt more often to protect my hand by betting or raising when the pot is a little bigger, or especially really big. And when the pot's small or really small, I'm going to be thinking of ways that I can try to encourage my opponent to put money into the pot. And against an aggressive opponent, that's frequently by checking to him and letting him do the betting.
Let's talk a little bit about slow playing and fast playing. I think, to quote you, you said you like to fast play 99.9% of the time. Mm-hmm. One of the concepts I struggle with, and I'll give you an example. Let's say that, some guy raises and it gets called in a couple spots, and you call out of the blind with like Jack 9 suited, and the board comes out Ace Jack Jack. So you flop trip jacks. Instead of playing it on the flop for a raise, you check raise the turn. Is that a slow play per se in limit hold'em?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that's a slow
play.
It
is, okay.
Because you're delaying, your aggressive action when you do think you're overwhelmingly likely to have the best hand. This is a good example. Ace Jack Jack is a really good board that makes it for a great example, because when you do decide to do the line you suggested, check call and check raise the turn, what you're really saying is you hope that you'll get more value from your opponent when he has something that can call you down, because you want him to call that turn raise. You don't want him to fold to the turn raise. Obviously, you have a monster. So you're hoping that he has enough hand that can bet the turn and then call down a raise. But there's not that many hands on an Ace Jack Jack board that can really, make that play. I mean, he's going to have usually an ace. And so while you may be able to get a little bit more value from a hand like Ace X in a situation like that, you give up the opportunity to make value from worse hands. And at the same time, when your opponent has a strong second best hand, you kind of tip him off that you were slow playing something, and you may be able to get more action by taking an alternative approach. So let's say your opponent has something like Ace King, the flop come Ace Jack Jack, and you have Jack 9. I mean, you're in a perfect situation. Obviously, it's like a complete cold deck for him. You're going to win a lot of bets. But if you check call and then check raise on the turn, you're not representing that you have like an Ace X type of hand. You're representing that you have 3 jacks or sometimes a semi-bluff of some kind. So he's never going to put in more action with his Ace King. You're maybe going to get him to call you down. And if he's a really strong thinking player and your range isn't balanced enough with enough bluffs in that spot, he may even be able to get away from his hand, which would be a complete disaster. If you just check raise that hand right away on the flop, he's never going to fold his ace-king, and he may even overvalue it because now you're representing a much wider range of marginal hands, such as maybe any ace, you might have any sort of two Broadway cards that have a gut shot and be semi-bluffing, and you're going to be much more likely to get your opponent to put in more action in the hand, either by 3-betting the flop, or possibly even like raising you on the turn, which would be, a great spot for you to get in multiple bets. So, I think that that's a good flop example of a situation where people just aren't thinking. They're not giving their opponent any credit for being able to think about what you're representing by check calling and then check raising on the turn.
And I kind of see this concept now in a new light, because especially if it's shorthanded or heads up, you may very well check raise ace 10 or ace 9 on an ace jack jack board. But when you check call the flop and now check raise the turn, it's almost like a situation we've talked a lot about on the show, that your hand has medium strength where you probably wouldn't check raise the turn because you're in a spot where you're way ahead, way behind, right?
Yeah, give you that same ace-10, and it's like, what would be the value in the turn check raise there, the majority of the time? Your opponent, the fact that he even bet again on the turn is pretty scary for your ace-10, so, you're not beating that many hands that are going to pay you off. It's hard to find the value in that situation.
And, again, with that situation with ace, jack, jack, and you've got jack 9, let's say there's 3 or 4 people in there. Obviously, the answer to this question depends. But is that a spot where you might actually bet 3-bet as opposed to check raise there?
Yes, except for the fact that now this flop texture is bad for that play. Ace, jack, jack, and you just bet out. It's going to be hard to get in a bet 3-bet against a lot of worse hands. Your opponent's going to have to be pretty bad to want to raise you on this flop with his ace and then pay off a 3-bet and pay off turn and river bets, because you're representing something that's usually stronger than like a pair of aces there, or you have some sort of semi-bluff. So his best course of action is usually just going to be to call you down and hope that you have the semi-bluff part of your range. He doesn't have to really worry about giving free cards because you're betting, so you're charging yourself if you do have that draw. At the same time, he doesn't have to worry about scare cards coming for him because he has the toppest pair and no real way for his hand to decrease in value at this point. So this particular flop texture doesn't lend well to that play. A better one is one with lower cards where you can kind of represent a more marginal hand or a draw. In a multi-way pot, if I had something like flop a set on an 8-6-5 with a flush draw flop. There, I much prefer a bet 3-bet because you're going to get your opponent to raise that flop to try to protect his pair of eights or certainly his overpair. And sometimes you're even going to get opponents that are going to put in multiple bets that are just a draw, so you're going to have them raising an open-ended straight draw or a flush draw. And at that point, you're thrilled to get in multiple bets, especially in a multi-way pot. So that's a flop texture where you end up getting more action when you have a strong hand. And your opponent can still put you on a lot of draws, so he doesn't necessarily fold at any point in the hand or fear that you just outflopped him.
So, again, just to kind of interpret what you're saying, and it does really, I look at Limit Hold'em now kind of in a new light, because I remember in those games in 2040 and 3060 live games, players would play this dance where they would almost always be slow playing. They would, if the board came out with a pair on it and they check raised the turn, it was almost 100% that they had, trips. And then I started to exploit that in the sense where, with that example with ace jack jack, if I raised it up with ace king and, kind of a loose passive fish called me, and the board came out ace jack jack and they checked, and of course I bet for value and then they called, I knew that they would just call down with ace X, but they were never capable of check raising the turn with a semi bluff. And when they check raised the turn, they always had 3 jacks in that spot. So they actually got me to fold a hand that they might have been able to get more value out of by playing it fast early on in the hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason that they continue to make that play is, one, they don't really have a good concept of like a balanced hand range in their mind. If they're check call, check raising the turn there with trips, what are they ever, is there any hand that's not value raising the turn there that they could possibly have? If they could sometimes have a semi-bluff, then all of a sudden at least their play has a little bit of deception to it. But as it is, they allow you to make the correct counter adjustment, which is to just like bet fold your ace king right there on the turn. You bet for value. Now they check raise. They're representing only a part of their range that has you drawing to 2 outs, and so you just correctly fold. The only reason that they can get away with that is because most opponents are just incapable of bet folding top pair. So yeah, I tell students all the time, on our forums we have a number of players that play both online and live, especially in small stakes, live games for people that are just getting into poker. If you're playing live $4, $8 full ring, the bet fold should be your bread and butter play. I mean, you should be bet folding your marginal hands, your decent hands. Everything up to your monsters should be almost always bet folded, because people that raise you on the turn in the river are just overwhelmingly likely to have the nuts, or what they consider to be the nuts. Contrasted that with online, where I'm much more happy in a high-stakes online game to be taking lines that involve check calling or check raising, because it exploits the fact that your opponents are much more likely to put in bets with marginal hands. Whereas live, when they make aggressive actions, I'm looking for the fold button as quick as I can find it.
Well, it's interesting, too, because, I play at Commerce almost, on a regular basis in 10, 20, 20, 40, no limit. So I see that those limit games at Commerce are on the same side. I've hopped in them a few times. It seems to me like the 100, 200 usually has a fairly tough lineup. But it wouldn't surprise me, though, if people are making some of those same, check raising the turn only with trips mistakes in that 40 and that 60 game. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people that aren't from Southern California may not have it in their, have a conception in their minds of how like a live 40-80 game plays out here. But I don't really consider most of the 40-80 games to be very tough. In fact, if I have a student that plays online and plays 5, 10, 6 max, and they want to know what limit they can play live, I'll tell them, come out to California, I'll put you in a 40-80 game immediately, because you'll be a big favorite with your overwhelming experience of playing with all these marginal hands. I mean, if anything, I just have to remind them to go back to their more trusting roots, where they just, when people raise them, they just need to be more trusting and fold, because they're representing a very, very narrow range of hands when they make that action. They're not very well balanced, and and it is somewhat easy to exploit. So I totally agree with you. Even some good online players even believe that the Commerce 100, 200 game definitely suffers from that. Though my experience is that the game is tougher than people first give it credit for. I mean, a lot of the regulars in that game are very experienced at playing high stakes live limit hold'em, and just through that experience, they've really gained an ability to have some deception that people might not first think that they're capable of. Even the bad players in that game that are way too loose and putting in too much action still have the capacity to show up with bluffs and value bets in situations. And just having that balance in their range of being aggressive and having a bluff or a value bet is enough to make the game tougher than the majority of games out there.
Chris, I want to ask you one more question before we wrap things up. And that's what you called, I think, in your videos, a disaster, allowing this particular disaster to happen. And that's when you call down with a hand like ace high, like ace 10, and you're no good against an opponent who has bluffed with a hand like ace jack.
Yeah.
Can we talk about why that is a disaster?
Yeah, because it kind of allows your opponent to get value in a situation where he wasn't capable of getting that value on his own. You kind of helped him into it. And actually, it's funny because ace high, yeah, that's an okay example of it. Although it's rare these days that you find a player on online mid stakes or higher that will be bluffing with a good ace high like that. I mean, people pretty much recognize that when they have ace jack there, if they get called, their opponent's either going to have a pair or their ace high was already good. They're not really getting pairs to fold very often. But it happens to me all the time. I mean, I'm a guy who does make marginal call downs, and it's funny when it happens live too. I've called a guy down with king 10 high and gotten shown king jack that was just completely bluffing, and then I just tap the table and muck my hand, and everybody goes what the hell just happened? I mean, it's hilarious, but it is a disaster because one, you could have just raised and your opponent would have folded if you had known that your hand was the worst hand, and two, the reason that you can make some of those call downs with really marginal hands, ace high, king high, whatever, is because, and you mentioned the key word earlier, and we haven't really talked about it too much today, but your opponent is polarized. They're not capable of getting thin value with fourth and fifth pair and their strong ace highs. They're really only value betting good hands, top pair, a monster, a straight, a flush, a set, or they're just flat out bluffing. And when that's true, you can make those marginal call downs very profitably because your opponent's not going to show you fifth pair or ace high. He's just going to check that hand down. So, if you accidentally run into an opponent who thinks he's bluffing with a hand as strong as king or ace high there, and come to find out that really, you just didn't realize that he's actually bluffing with a hand like that, then he's not quite as polarized as you first thought, and you may need to take some alternative approach to get more value by possibly like bluff raising, because at least then, if you have a really weak hand like queen high, at least then he may be bluffing here. Unfortunately, I have queen high. Well, I guess I could raise, because then at least fold his king high and his ace high and his fifth pair. So that's pretty much it. You just want to, it's a disaster when you think you're calling down a polarized opponent and it turns out that he wasn't so polarized.
Well, then how do you decide whether to call or to raise? Like with that example that you gave with king 10, is that a mistake that you made? Should you have raised that river because of the possibility that you don't beat some bluffs?
Well, it's one of those things I think you file away for future information or for future reference. I mean, at the time, with the information that I had about the guy, my thinking was, this guy is not capable of value betting thinly. Therefore, he's just flat out bluffing here, or he has some sort of monster hand. He may show me top pair, and I'm gonna lose. He may show me a set, or he's gonna show me 9 high, no pair, and I'm gonna win. But then after he shows you that he's bluffing with a hand like a strong king high or an ace high, now you have to, the next time you get into a hand like that against a guy like that, you have to say, like, okay, this guy may be bluffing with a hand better than mine here. If I deem it profitable to possibly call him here, probably it would be better to make a bluff raise myself, hoping that, he folds one of those marginal hands. So with the information that I had at the time, or with the information that you're usually able to get from your opponents, it might not be a mistake, but certainly, after one disaster like that, you definitely need to file that information away and use it in the future, rather than making those really thin call downs, taking an alternative line.
Well, Chris, that's going to do it for us this week. I appreciate you taking the time. Of course, you can head over and watch your videos, right, at deucescrack.com.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Bart. I mean, it's a lot of fun. I love rambling about Limit Hold'em. I pretty much do it at least once a week on Deuces Cracked in any of my video series. They're always going to focus on some sort of limit game. I've done everything from full ring, low stakes online limit to heads up, mid stakes to mid to high stakes 6-max, and now some triple draw. So pretty much, I hope anybody out there will come and check my videos out at Deuces Cracked. And thanks, Bart, for having me on.
Super. Well, I will keep my fingers crossed because I'm supposed to be in London next week. So hopefully, all of you listening to this, I will be recording next week's episode from, I'm not sure if it's the Vic or Leicester Square where the poker room is. But anyways, I appreciate everyone's suggestions on the forums about what types of guests that they want to see. So thanks again for everyone for joining us, and we will see you next week right here on Cash Plays.